Welcome, everyone. We're going to be getting started here in a couple of minutes. We are going to go live on Facebook. You can share the live video on our SV at Home Facebook page. If you'd like to share it with your networks, we invite you to do so. We'll be getting started here in a couple of minutes.
Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome all to SV at Home's Affordable Housing Month Legislative Update. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Matthew Reed. I'm the Policy Manager here at SV at Home. We want to go off script for a second. And in light of yesterday's tragic events here in San Jose, we want to take a moment of silence to honor the memory of those who lost their lives and the families and the communities that have been affected and will be affected for a long time, I'm sure. So if we could just take a moment of silence. There will be a community vigil being held this evening at 6 o'clock at San Jose City Hall. And we will put a link in the chat to a site that has been established for donations to support the families of those who are facing unimaginable loss today. So with that, we are really pleased to have you here for SV at Home's annual Affordable Housing Month, Silicon Valley. This Affordable Housing Month, we've had over 50 events. We are getting close to the end, and activities that highlight the important work of SV at Home and all of our community partners and housers and what folks are doing around housing issues all across Santa Clara County and the region. There's no better time to solidify your houser status and support this critical work than today, by becoming an SV at Home member and supporter at bit.ly, it's on the screen, /SVH member. The link can also be found in the chat, I believe. And we want to highlight all of our wonderful sponsors who make Affordable Housing Month possible. Before we begin, as is customary, we want to highlight elected officials and their representatives who are joining us today. I would start with Zach Ross from the office of Assemblymember Mark Berman, Alex Kobayashi from the office of Senator Josh Becker, Andre Wara, Masap Binlock. I practiced this ahead of time. I apologize, Andre. From the office of Senator Bob Wachowski, Cupertino Councilmember Hung Wei, Gilroy Councilmember Rebecca Armendariz, Gilroy Councilmember Zach Hilton, Mountain View Council Vice Mayor Lucas Ramirez, Los Altos Councilmember Lisa Schmidt, City of Santa Clara Councilmember Kathy Watanabe, Sunnyvale Councilmember Alyssa Cisneros, Andrea Eberly from the office of Assemblymember Mark Stone. We know there's several other government staff and elected officials who've joined us today as well. So if we missed any of you in the shout out, please introduce yourself and your position in the chat. And thank you so much for joining us today. So today we are thrilled to have a stellar panel to provide a housing and legislative update. With the new Biden administration in Washington and the new legislature seated in Sacramento, 2021 is shaping up to be an exciting and very complicated year for innovative government action to support affordable housing development and protections for vulnerable communities in the South Bay, particularly as we come out of the COVID epidemic. From federal approaches to rent relief to discussions of social housing in the state capital to new state-level housing element enforcement powers, there are a myriad of new opportunities for government at all levels to make their mark on getting more affordable housing built and ensuring that people of all incomes and abilities have access to safe, stable, and affordable homes. So let me jump right in and introduce our esteemed panel, which includes California State Senator Dave Cortese. We're expecting to be joined by California State Assembly Member Ash Kalra, who is in committee at the moment, but will be joining us later in the event. Mark Stivers, Director of Legislative and Regulatory Advocacy at CHPC, California Housing Partnership Corporation. Pedro Galvao, the Policy Director at Nonprofit Housing of Northern California, and Graciela Castillo-Krings with Sacramento Advocates. We're going to begin by inviting Senator Cortese to share district and Sacramento housing issues before we transition to our panel of policy experts to expand on the current housing legislative topics. And then we will have about 20 minutes remaining at the end, and we will let panelists answer questions from the audience and wrap up by hopefully inviting Assemblymember Kalra to close the event at about 3 o'clock. And with that, I'm going to move to our legislative update. So I'd like to begin by introducing Senator Cortese. Has been a strong local leader for a long time here in the South Bay and is an active member of the State Senate Housing Lead Group. With that, Senator Cortese, please jump in and let us know what your perspective is on where we're at.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you to all of you at Silicon Valley at home. Thank you for the work you do, the organizing work, and the panelists who come from different organizations or sectors. Thank you for your efforts. Certainly, it's another one of those issues. It seems like the state has a half a dozen crises or issues going on right now, and they're all going to take a combined effort, a collaborative effort. It's going to take bridge building, and that's not untrue of housing. We talk about how difficult climate is because there's climate policy is because there's oil interests, because there's workforce transition, there's building trades issues, but we talk about other issues, let's say landlord-tenant issues, which come into this space that we're talking about today, and in sort of the polarization. Housing overall, I think, is just as much one of those issues where I won't say this over and over again, but I believe, especially more so than ever after my 4.5 active months in Sacramento, plus the month of December, if you want to count that, it's very evident that we have a lot of bridge building to do, even intra-sector, within the advocacy groups, organizations, and interests that represent all that needs to be done in housing. The 3 Ps we kind of use as a simplifier to talk about protections, preservations, production. I think the legislature figured out, and you know this, but the legislature figured out just before I got here that production has to happen. I think, with a lot of groups, yourselves included, who have been making that okay among the public, it allowed Senate Pro Tem Tony Adkins to form a housing work group, to invite a half dozen legislators, including me, to be part of that group and just openly say, we're going for production. A few years ago, we all know that there seemed to be some fear about that. It almost seemed to be taboo to go right after the production issue as if it was something good. A lot of effort in those years on protection, and not much on tenant protections, particularly not much on preservation per se. But now you're seeing it all. And I just had the opportunity yesterday to to cast my aye vote on a bill I co-authored, SB 9. Doing something very straightforward that simplifies essentially the rules that we've been so bottlenecked and accustomed to under the Subdivision Map Act, in terms of how we divide up lots, and allowing that to happen in a way that increases housing production in areas where cities are willing to take advantage of that opportunity. And you see San Jose campaigning very heavily right now on sort of their version of opportunity housing. But I think the pro tem and my colleagues, as I got here, made it very, very clear that whether it's the perfect posture from a production standpoint or not, they want to be respectful of local control when it comes to the ultimate zoning decisions that decide where to use these tools and where not to use these tools. So for now, it seems, amongst my colleagues, the legislation you're going to see come out, whether it's, Scott Wiener's, whether it's principal author being the pro tem or my legislation, you're going to see some deference to local control when it comes to those final zoning decisions, and sort of a mantra that says this is permissive. We are trying to create rules for you that take away the excuses for having these long-term bottlenecked processes in terms of housing production. I have a bill that is a theme that you're going to see from me probably for multiple years and multiple sessions, which is a bill that goes into HCD. It creates a unit for local surplus lands to go into housing production. There's already legislation, as you know, that takes state excess lands. And by the way, there's 44,000 of those, and there's only about 4 or 5 currently that are targeted for housing production. So lots of blue sky there, but HCD is doing basically nothing with cities and counties. And you look even at my home county, our home county, Santa Clara County, and see 14 cities that aren't San Jose that don't have fully funded housing departments. So they're not Santa Clara County. They don't have an Office of Supportive Housing. What do they need in terms of technical assistance? What do they need in terms of the opportunity, the matchmaking for tax credits, and maybe credit enhancement from the state at some point? We haven't seen the state come in with its credit rating and start backing up deals, whether it's for nonprofit housing builders or others. We haven't seen that. We saw it for years and years with the federal government, with HUD, programs like 221B and all these programs that created a AAA credit rating that came in and backed the play of local developers to bring down interest rates. Those are things we can do at the state level. The bill I introduced, SB 791, is that bill. Let me just close by saying, I think there was, before I came on, a question posed: what do you see as obstacles? I said it at the outset in a roundabout way. We have to get on one page. We all have to be speaking the same language as much as possible. We have people that are pro-housing, that have tremendous expertise and experience in actually building housing. We have others who really come in more on the advocacy side. Maybe they don't have that hands-on experience and come with a little different language, a little different perspective. We have tenants' rights advocates who aren't necessarily focused on production and aren't really speaking that language. We've got to learn how to speak in unison, because if not, what ends up happening in the legislature is, as these bills come through, frankly, the committee staff themselves, in my humble opinion, get confused because they're bombarded with different opinions from within the housing sector itself. And so you get bill analysis that basically looks like, well, these housing folks are for it, these housing folks are against it, right? This big industry giant is for it, this big industry trade group is against it. Hey, we're all supposed to be trying to get the housing production. And I think it's incumbent on us, and I include myself. That's not an indictment on anyone else. I think we all have to do whatever we can to build a coalition that speaks in unison. Now that we've got the legislature's attention, including my attention, now that we have that, let's not squander it. Let's come in as much as we possibly can, speaking the same language with large coalitions and get the job done. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator Cortese. We really appreciate that. In the interest of time, I'm going to pivot immediately to our panelists for a deeper look. So let me just throw it out there. Through a historic year, what's the status of housing legislation? What's looking good? What's coming up? What's coming up down the pipeline? Why don't we go ahead and start with, just to keep us focused, the historic surplus that we're seeing at the state level. And we know that that's being augmented by additional promised resources from federal recovery dollars. So the governor just came out with the May revise. Mark, and I wonder if you wanted to kick us off and talk a little bit about what was there as you saw it, and sort of walk us through the process.
Yeah, thank you. I think with respect to the budget, we in the affordable housing community have very much to be thankful for at the moment. It is not final. The legislature will pass a budget by June 15th. The governor has until July 1st to sign a budget. And obviously there may be some negotiation in there along the way. But it looks like those dates will be held. And what the things that look very likely for affordable housing is another year of an additional $500 million in low-income housing tax credits. That's a big thing. We've been pushing to make that permanent. It's still annual, but this is now 3 years in a row. The state will continue to spend another $400 million of cap and trade funds on the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program, which is affordable housing near transit that helps reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That's been ongoing. It looks like the legislature and the governor will put $250 million into the infill infrastructure grant program, which funds infrastructure, but that supports affordable housing. And then some new things that have come up recently that also look very likely is that we've got about 140 developments that HCD has already awarded funds to that are stuck in the queue for low-income housing tax credits. And it may be many years before those projects get unstuck. And this surplus is giving the ability for the state to buy out those, what would be tax credits, right? And to replace the tax credits with state funds. And the governor has proposed $1.75 billion to do that equity replacement. And it's looking very likely that will occur. And so that would be a huge shot in the arm, not only for those projects that would move forward immediately, but also it would kind of help clear the backlog and allow future projects a little bit more ease to get the low-income housing tax credits that they need. And then lastly, the governor has proposed $300 million to kind of preserve a number of developments that HCD has funded in long ago that are at risk of converting now to market rate because they're at the end of their affordability terms. And those obviously, as we try and construct more affordable housing, we got to take care of the stuff that we have. We can't be going backwards on one hand and forward on the other. So that money is actually very well received as well. So those are all things that look very likely. That's, I've been in this 25 years and that is an amazing budget. We've never come anything close to that out of state funds. And there are some other things that are still out there pending that are still possible. A coalition of groups has requested $500 million to purchase sort of market rate housing and convert it to affordable housing, kind of what we call the preservation of naturally occurring affordable housing. And I think that has some traction in the legislature, although a little still to be seen whether that comes through. So, and then that's not even touching on the homelessness stuff, which is not exactly my purview, but obviously the state is making a massive investment through the Home Key program and others to kind of increase the amount of units that we have to bring people in off the streets, which is, obviously a key human tragedy that we see rolling out every day, but also of great concern to many voters of California.
Great. Pedro, you want to jump in and fill out any additional comments? That was a tremendous overview, Mark. Thank you.
Yeah, first, just thank you, Matthew, for having me on this panel. It is great to work with SB at Home, and you all do a fabulous job with Affordable Housing Month and just on advocacy in Santa Clara County. So just thank you for this opportunity. Building off of what Mark said, we are really excited about this budget. It is historic, with $12 billion being dedicated in total to housing and homelessness. And this dwarfs, some of our most ambitious asks. It also, I would say, the budget is the brightest star in the sky when it comes to housing, into housing policy in 2021. Building off of what Mark said, we are thrilled about these investments. We're also cognizant that they don't fully take care of the needs. So we're working with the legislature to fill in the gaps. Mark brought up the 140 HCD projects that are stalled. And these are projects that have sites, have local funding, are literally ready to go, but for infusion of additional resources. And the California Housing Partnership, NPH, have identified that need at around $3 billion, and the budget funds about 60% of that. So we're pushing for the budget to fully fund all of those projects, because there's no reason why affordable housing that's ready to be built, and when the state has a historic surplus, for that housing to continue to be stalled. On the preservation front, again, we're thrilled to see the $300 million investment that the budget calls for to preserve projects, legacy projects that were funded by HCD. But as Mark said, there's a broader coalition that's calling for converting market rate units to affordable housing. So as NPH, we're looking to see, can this be increased from 300 to 500 million? And can we make it more flexible so that more of our communities have access to it? In general, we think that this is a really tremendous opportunity, and we're going to keep working with the legislature to see what we can do. To put it all in context, depending on who you talk to, the governor will tell you that we have a $75.7 billion surplus. I was reading a Cal Matters article that said we had $100 billion, so a ton of money. And now is our opportunity to make truly historic investments. And we think what the governor put out is incredible. And now is our chance to fill in the gaps, get us to where we really need to be.
Yeah, ironically, this is a sort of a historic opportunity coming out of what seemed like a very dark and challenging time. I think we're seeing that on the local level as well. Are there other spending bills that are active in the legislature that are going to be affected by some of the surplus discussion, or are these sort of being kept separate? Is there anything we should be paying attention to? And then I'm interested in hearing from all of you about whether or not this generally has legs. Sometimes, the May statement changes a lot by the time the budget gets signed. And so is this one of those years, or is there a lot of momentum behind this?
Just on the latter question, I mean, I think that I can sort of put that in two categories. Most of these things I think are actually very likely. I don't think we're going to see much change in the budget environment between now and July 1st. And the legislature is going to act on the information we all have today, and that looks very rosy, and I think these things are going to happen. There will be some changes around the margins as the legislature and the governor negotiate, but I think the broad strokes are looking pretty clear at this point in time. And Graciela has been very involved in budgets over the years. So
yeah,
you want to add on that, Graciela?
I was going to bring her in. Graciela, tell us what's actually happening.
No, I think Mark is right. I mean, at the end of the day, the actual numbers when it comes to the budget, that has to pass by June 15th. And so I think what we are expecting is a lot of those expenditures and those commitments are going to move forward. The question is, for some of the policy, and especially for some of the programs that the governor is proposing, we're probably going to see further negotiations on the parameters of those policies during the summer. So a lot of the times there's the budget bill, which is, again, how much money are we spending where? And then sometimes the implementation of that, the policy bills, don't come until after, right? They're called trailer bills because they trail the budget. And sometimes they trail it. Sometimes you will see a budget conversation happening in August. And this year, the legislature doesn't adjourn until September. So there's more conversations to come.
Okay. So we're at the beginning. Pedro, you have anything to add on that from your?
Yeah, just adding, like answering your questions around the implications of the budget on spending bills, and I also saw a question come in the chat that's relevant. So we have seen the budget influence some spending bills. Earlier in the session, we were thrilled to see SB 5, which is a housing bond that would have placed a $6.5 billion housing bond in the 2022 ballot. That bill is being made into a 2-year bill. It's being held for a longer period of time to allow for just to see what comes out of the budget, because the budget investment is so generous compared to where we were at the beginning of the year. The other big investment, AB 71, also known as the Bring California Home Act, that's something that NPH is co-sponsoring, which means we are strongly in support. One of the cheerleaders, want to get everybody on board. And that bill continues to move forward. What it would do is create a permanent source of funding for services for people experiencing homelessness. And up until now, we have seen some very generous investments from the legislature to address homelessness, but they've all been one time. And every time it requires setting up a new program. Sometimes the new program doesn't align with the old program. And we think, just given how terrible the homelessness crisis is in our state, it is high time for an ongoing funding source. And so what AB 71 does is it aligns, it raises taxes in California on corporations' overseas profits. It would raise that tax at the same level as the federal government to pay for these crucial services, and it would bring in about $1 billion a year. We're calling for, and through the budget, as Mark mentioned, there's significant investments to address homelessness. That bill, the Bring California Home Act, comes with a pretty robust spending plan to actually move us towards ending homelessness, people who are unsheltered experiencing homelessness, decreasing that by 75% within the next 5 years. And so what we're pushing for is actually for the budget, as legislators and the governor deliberate, to include that spending plan that has been crafted by experts from across the state, by some of our biggest cities like Los Angeles and Oakland, that will actually result in bringing people indoors and decreasing the number of people who are unsheltered experiencing homelessness by 75% within the next 5 years.
That's actually a really interesting point, Pedro, because I think we are right now having a great budget year. I think no one anticipated that we were going to have the surplus that we do, but it is a one-time budget, which means if something were to happen next year, again, depending on, we're hopefully out of the pandemic, but let's say there was something devastating, the state coffers would not be available. And so the question that we've always struggled with when it comes to housing is, how do we actually ensure that we have ongoing investments that are stable and that people can rely on, right? If you are developing something, if you're in even affordable developers, how do you know that the money will continue to be there year after year? And that's really what we have struggled with in the last, I would say the last decade, having that source of funding that's available, that's just going to be continuous, as opposed to just always kind of tethered to whether the general fund is doing well or not. So just, I mean, again, great year today, and or now, but I am worried about what happens 5 years from now when we don't have that surplus.
On that somber note, let me just remind folks, if you have questions to the panelists, we'll have a period at the time. If you could put them in the chat window, we'll try to answer as many as we can in the window that we have. So it's clear that these are all connected, but Pedro, I wanted to come back and talk about what the key bills are that are important to housers. I think you've touched on a couple of them. There is a legislative process as well, and so we really want to hear, what you think's important and how we're doing.
Thanks again for that, Matthew. Yeah, so I've already talked about AB 71. That bill passed out of Assembly appropriations and is now on the floor of the Assembly, and we're hoping to get it to the Senate. And we think that that's a really critical bill because, as Graciela said, it would lead to those ongoing investments for services for people experiencing homelessness. This year, we're actually seeing a limited number of bills in general. There's actually an agreement between the Senate and the Assembly to limit the number of bills each legislator is carrying to 12. And that's due to just capacity issues because of COVID. And because of that, there's just fewer bills around. But another bill that we care a lot about that's in the Senate housing package is SB 8. And that's by Senator Skinner. That bill, what it does is it continues holding down the progress that we made back in 2019, where there was another bill called SB 330 that passed that basically said, if you have a housing development and it follows all the local rules, here's how we expect it to go through the process. It regulates the number of hearings, it makes sure that the process gets a fair shot. And that a renewal of that bill is going through, and we think it's important for it to go forward. We're actually really supportive of two bills that the California Housing Partnership has. So I'll turn it over to Mark to talk about those.
Yeah, just briefly, those two bills that we are pursuing that are faring well so far. One is AB 989, and it creates a different venue, an administrative venue for dealing with situations where a local government has turned down or denied or imposed conditions on an affordable housing development that make it infeasible. So right now, California has a very good law called the Housing Accountability Act that says that local government, if they're going to do that, needs to have one of 5 very specific findings. The issue is that if a local government does turn down a project, developers are rarely willing to spend 2 years and hundreds of thousands of dollars in court to enforce the law. And so the idea here is based on things that what Massachusetts and Oregon and Illinois and some other states have done is create an administrative process where you can resolve these issues in about 60 or 90 days. The state would be able to sort of review the case. If the city violated the law, they could approve the project. If not, the local judgment would stand. And so that bill has quite a bit of support, including SV at Home, and we're so far is on the Assembly floor and looks positive that it will pass. The second bill that could be taken up on the Assembly floor as early as today is AB 1423. And that bill, basically what it does, it says that HCD, when they make awards right now, they make an award, but they don't actually fund the award until construction is complete on an affordable housing development. And if we can get HCD funds to come in earlier during the construction period, we can actually save hundreds of thousands of dollars per project in interest costs. And, we're all trying to reduce the cost of affordable housing. That's one thing the state has direct control over. So AB 1423 would give developers the option of receiving those HCD funds during the construction period. And that bill so far has had more or less a consent vote. There's not been a single no vote in either house or in either committee. And we are looking forward to working with HCD on sort of the details of that as the bill moves through. But those are two things that look positive that we can get done this year.
In fact, I have to now share because we had a very good day yesterday. SB 9 cleared the Senate floor. It still has to go through the Assembly, but we're really excited to see that piece of legislation move forward. It is one of the SB 9 is going to help make it easier to do duplex and subdivide single family lots. And the reality is, I think it can be a really strong tool to promote home ownership, which can help actually build generational wealth. And right now, as we're looking around, people in California are having a really hard time renting. They're having a really hard time buying homes. And that really does impact a lot of the communities. And so we're excited to see just those pieces of legislation moving forward.
Yeah, I was going to follow up with you on that. Senator Cortese had mentioned that, and Pedro mentioned SB 8. We know there was a whole package of Senate bills. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how those are doing, which ones we've lost, which ones still have legs.
Definitely. Well, actually, one of the other bills that was in the package was signed, SB 7, which is going to be a big issue, especially in San Jose, as we know. That will help a project that is hoping to bring close to 6,000 units of housing. and a large percentage of them affordable. So SB7 passed, which we're really excited about. As Pedro already alluded to, SB8 is still something that we're working on. SB9 was another big component. So they're moving. You know, we will have a better sense of the full range and scope of the bills that are left, excuse me, by the end of next week. As Pedro was saying, legislators are supposed to notify leadership as to which vehicles are going to continue moving. And then next week is going to be a big week when it comes to Assembly and Senate floor votes.
Yeah. So I know we're in the end game period. I'm not in the end game. I just watch from abroad, but I know you all are in the end game period. So maybe we could talk just a little more about what some of the greatest challenges have been this session. You know, we know it's a very complicated environment. There's still stuff that's happening. What has that been like? How do we understand, you know, what that process has been and what we're likely to see in the next couple of weeks? And I'll come back then and ask you to forecast the future.
I think, and my colleagues might agree with me, I think one of the hardest things to do is negotiate complicated policy virtually. It used to be, you know, everybody would get into a room, 2 hours later we come out and, you know, hopefully have some language we can share with everybody else. I think trying to have those really difficult, nuanced conversations virtually, or trying to play phone tag or arrange meetings, that's made it just that much more difficult. And I think that's one of the reasons you see also a agreement to decrease the number of bills, simply because it takes longer to really have those public discussions. On one hand, it's really good. The public has more access because now people are working from home, they can call in and have their voices heard. On the flip side, it's harder to have those deeper conversations in committee about that back and forth discussion that used to happen. We don't see that as much. So on one hand, you have more access. On the other hand, that access is not quite as robust as it was before. So kind of a double-edged sword.
You know, for a while we were hearing that the recall movement with the governor was just the world was gonna stop in its tracks because everything was too dangerous to jump into in that environment. And then it was the COVID response was gonna overwhelm a lot of the substantive stuff. And I know there have been some issues with labor. Pedro, Mark, do you have any sense of was that right at the time and we've moved on from that, or are we still sort of in that environment where it's difficult to just get oxygen because there's so much going on?
I haven't seen a huge impact from the recall effort in general on housing bills. Obviously the governor comes in later in the stage rather than where we are today in sort of policy committees in the legislature. So maybe that might change my view later on, but so far I haven't seen that play much of a role. COVID, you know, obviously is a day-to-day reality for us, but I don't know that it's affecting politics. I think the fact that so much is being done through the budget this year is a challenge because it's a very compressed timeline. You don't have the same amount of time you do in a regular legislative session to work things out, as Graciela was talking about, but also it's just not as kind of a inclusive a process. It's a little bit more exclusive, which makes it more challenging, sort of. It's kind of a little bit of a black box, and you're trying to get inside a black box sometimes. But as for the labor issues, so let me back up a second. Senator Cortese mentioned it's often hard to get all the players on the same page, right? And even within the housing community, and that's always been an issue. And there's good reasons for that. We all want to do the same thing, but we have different thoughts on how we best get there. But I think one of the new dynamics this year that has been a real challenge is that, the state building trades have been our partners through most housing battles of the past, right? They were co-sponsors of the last housing bond with Housing California. They've actually been really good partners over the years. But in the last year and a half now, they have demanded that sort of every affordable housing development have essentially union-only contractors. And I think we are very interested in working with our labor friends. We think there's a lot to be said about a continued partnership, and we actually are fairly pro-labor in a lot of things that we do, but an absolute requirement just doesn't work, right? There are certain parts of the state where we don't have union contractors at all, and if there's a requirement, a project can't move forward. In other parts of the state, we have union contractors, but not that, we're not going to get 3 bids if we limit ourselves to only union contractors. And then if you only get one union contractor bid, they have complete market power to set the price wherever they want, which is, something we can't afford. So, we're trying to work with them and work them out the solution. That's been tricky, but we're working, trying to get the legislature to sort of engage here and help us resolve this issue so that we can, and this is affecting, a little bit the budget, but also every bill in housing is being affected. And we need to get this issue resolved so that we can start rowing in the same direction again, and all pulling together to get affordable housing bills passed.
Okay, I want to keep us moving, but I want to give Pedro and Graciela an opportunity to respond to that. My next question is, what does the future hold? So maybe if you want to transition to these are our challenges now, and this is what we're looking at going forward, that would be great.
Sure. Well, it's always been challenging to pass major housing reforms in California. I mean, there's a reason why we're in such a hole. Every interest group has their sacred cow. Everyone comes at it with their own set of values, and it's really hard to forge consensus among all of the competing factions. And what we've seen with COVID are two things. Both a great deal of anxiety, and rightfully so, both in terms of what's going to happen at the state level, what's going to happen with me personally, what's going to happen with my family, what's going to happen with my job. And this anxiety has also seeped a little bit into the legislative process. There's also quite a bit of hope in thinking through what are new ways that we can build back stronger, remake society to be a little less harsh and more communal in the way that we live. And we've seen that with the federal government spending trillions of dollars on COVID relief. And as a result of that massive federal investment, California is in far better shape than what we expected it to be. We are not in the same place that we were back in the Great Recession. And so in looking forward, and actually, somebody in the chat asked this earlier. They asked about, the social housing bill, for instance. One thing about that bill, it's very intentionally set to be a place for discussion among all the stakeholders around how do we re-envision housing so that it's not a commodity, so that it's more of a right, so that everyone who needs a stable and affordable place to call home can have access to it. And what's the role of government? What are the roles of nonprofits, et cetera? And I think that there's more of a willingness to engage in these types of conversations and to make bold investments in the budget, and also to really look at systemically what are the things keeping us from housing all Californians who need to be housed. And so I think going forward, we've opened a Pandora's box in the sense that I think that we're now looking at, under every rock. We're now willing to challenge systems that have been established and have traditionally favored wealthier, whiter homeowners. And that's, I think, going to keep going. That's not going to go away. And there's great energy to create something, a system that can better serve Californians. And I'm hopeful that next year, with the start of the legislative session, we'll be talking about all of these great new affordable housing developments that are being built as a result of these budget investments, and why we need more of it, why we need a permanent source of funding, and what are the barriers that are keeping that reality from happening.
Sometimes courageous leadership is easier the further away you get from your home constituency, I think. And one of the challenges there's some of this is in the chat, is that really the implementation is local. And, we know we need to be doing a really good job with the new tools and resources that are brought to us. So I just want to acknowledge that. And hopefully some of that vision and courage and leadership will trickle down locally and make it easier to make sure we're implementing locally as well. Mark, Graciela, anything about the future? Are we on a glide path to continued progress? Are there bumps in the road ahead? Graciela, I appreciate you noting that so much of this is one-time resources, and we're going to face those, the challenges of that in the future. Are there anything else that we see about the future? How we're going to get stuff done in Sacramento?
One of the things that I hope we don't forget is, I think COVID at the end of the day pulled back the curtain to kind of make everybody very aware of the living conditions that a lot of people in California are living. They're living in overcrowded situations and housing, units that are not necessarily the best in terms of just, some of them need additional maintenance and whatnot. And it actually made it hard for the rest of us to ignore that reality. And I hope we don't forget that. I hope we continue to remember that when we talk about housing, as Pedro was saying, we need to house everybody. We need a variety of housing types. We need condos, we need micro units. We just need to be able to allow for choices for people to be able to make sure that they're housing their family and whatever they feel is appropriate for the family, right? And so I think that is one of the things I took away from COVID. I hope we don't forget that. I hope we continue to use that as a lens. So I feel that there's a lot of hope. I also think what we need to remember, and this is going to be a conversation I think is going to continue to happen, is we are doing really well from the general fund perspective. But I think when everybody was surprised when we were watching the state budget, because it was like, how did this happen? The economy was horrible. We have a lot of people in essential working environments and our essential workers that are not doing that well financially. And so I think there is a bit of a disconnect between the general fund and the reality for the average Californian. And so that is something that is going to continue to shape the discussions that we're having when it comes to some of housing people, making sure that they have enough money to actually pay some of the back rent. That's another big discussion that is coming. And I think we're not done yet, right? So I feel like I'm being a bit of the wet blanket. There are these positive things, but we can't forget the challenges that we also need to address.
Agreed. Helpful perspective. Mark, did you have anything to add about that?
No, there's a lot to be concerned about. There are many challenges. There are some I'm sure that will come up we're not even aware of yet. What gives me hope, and I'm always an optimist, and I think you have to be to some extent in this business, is that I don't think I've ever in my 25-year career around the legislature on housing issues seen kind of the will that we have now to work on housing, whether it's a governor who's been more pro-housing than any governor I've served under, whether it's, a pro tem who has a great affordable housing pedigree, to, an assembly that has oodles and oodles of bills and ideas coming out every year on how to fix the housing crisis, and, some real true champions over there. So, again, as the senator said, we got to get everyone rowing in the same direction. But it's actually amazing that we have this much energy and concentration on this topic. And I have to say that has not been the history of this issue in the legislature. So that gives me some optimism.
All right. So I'm hearing momentum, attention, level of seriousness, and there's no going back. But we have to be vigilant to make sure that we continue to take advantage of these moments. Is that a good summary? Just not. We can. So let me go to, we're hearing that we are expecting Assembly Member Kalra soon, but I want to bring a couple of the questions from the chat back. And Pedro, you've actually been doing a better job of tracking them than I have, but I want to come back to the social housing bill. We actually, I think, unfortunately, we had an event scheduled for this evening that we've canceled because of the vigil that's it's going to be happening in San Jose. But we've been getting a lot of questions about this, and I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. Is that opening doors for the discussion? Is that something that creates new space? I know we're probably in the early stages of that discussion, and it's not as much of your focus of getting critical stuff behind, but it's definitely getting people's imaginations going. So I wanted to throw that out as a question from the audience.
Definitely. I think it's important in the legislative process to begin asking these questions and to put bills out there to begin testing these concepts. I also, in addition to social housing, I saw one that was trying to do the same thing on universal basic income. It's really important to have these public conversations around these things. And and I do think that with the social housing conversation, it will unearth some really helpful things that we need to seriously look at as a state. How do we use public land? How do we invest our public resources? And how we even conceptualize of housing, period. Because right now it's society's primary means of wealth generation for middle-class families, but that's not, that doesn't necessarily have to be the only way. So we have to ask ourselves these questions. Otherwise, we'll just keep doing more of the same and getting to the same terrible shortage that's hurting so many people. I do want to note that I think Assemblymember Kalra is on, so I want to give him his time.
Okay, great. I appreciate that. Why don't we go ahead and do that? Assemblymember Kalra, thank you so much for fitting us into what's probably a tremendously complicated, busy day for you. We're pleased to have you here. You've missed what has been a wonderful discussion and update on the work that you're doing, but we're really interested to hear your perspective on the environment in Sacramento, what your priorities are, and how things.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and I apologize. I have not been able to. I was really looking forward to participating and watching and then being part of the conversation, but we unexpectedly got called in for session today, which was not expected because we do have session tomorrow due to the long weekend, but because we have a whole bunch of bills to get through between now and next week, they set sessions. So as you can see, I'll scan around. I'm actually on the portico. This is the only outdoor area that we have while we're in session, and you might hear background because we have a speaker here that's kind of amplifying what's happening inside. So I can't stay out too long, so I have to go inside and vote on a lot of really important bills. So I'll be very brief because I really appreciate the work of SV at Home and all the advocates that continue to push us up here in Sacramento. I think that I'm in general alignment in terms of what we need to do. And I think that in general, a number of the Bay Area members tend to be more in alignment with some of the more aggressive measures that we believe that we need to take in order to help facilitate more rapid and aggressive growth in housing, and particularly in affordable housing. And so, I've supported a wide range of bills, as well as right now we're focusing on the budget. We have billions of dollars that are coming in, over $9 billion in different forms for different purposes, in terms of housing, in terms of rental relief, in terms of more resources for Project Home Key and what have you. We also have legislation that I'm supportive of, what we're co-authoring in different forms, like AB 71 by Senator Luis Rivas, which is a modest increase in the corporate tax in order to deal with our unhoused population and getting folks housed. I also support a number of different measures, like the reduction of the parking requirements, I think, which is, especially in urban areas, has been a big obstacle for us to build higher density housing, affordable and otherwise. There's actually at least a couple dozen bills that have been introduced this year. And there was a comment on social housing. I absolutely believe that we have to move more towards social housing, because the reality is that simply requiring or depending on private development is not going to be enough. That we really have to, especially with public lands, whether it's Caltrans or BTA or whatever it might be, we have to find opportunities to take advantage of the land that we have, access land that we have. And in fact, when I was chair of BTA, one of the first things I did with our new general manager at the time, Nuria Fernandez, is have us take, to do an audit of all of our lands and get an inventory of the land we have. And I believe it leads us right now to a point where we have a great opportunity to build mixed-use housing on a place that makes the most sense, right next to our light rail stations, our bus lines, and what have you. And I believe the same is what we have been doing on BART, but we should be doing the same on Caltrain stops and what have you. Let's build the housing where it makes most sense and as high density as we possibly can. And so, I'm here to be helpful, and I think that I really, really appreciate SB at Home and the advocates that are chiming in more and more in recent years of what's happening here in Sacramento. And yeah, I think I'm being called in because I have to present a bill very soon. So I'm going to leave it at that. I just say thank you all. I apologize. I couldn't spend the amount of time that I had blocked off to be part of this really important conversation during Affordable Housing Month. And again, thank you to SV at Home and everyone that's participating today, and to our my colleague, my counterpart in the Senate, Senator Dave Cortese, who's also been doing a tremendous job jumping right in and being a part of the solutions that we need to put forward here in Sacramento.
Great. Thank you very much, Assemblyman Kalra. It's an honor to have you all representing us down here, and we really appreciate your ongoing commitment. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to jump back into the building.
Okay.
Bye.
Make sure we win.
You're going to try.
All right. So I see there's some additional discussion in the chat. I don't know if we've lost Graciela, but I wanted to just give Mark and Pedro a sort of final 30 seconds before we move to closing. If you have any last thoughts or last words. What we haven't really talked about is what do we do? What's our role? How do we plug in? How do we support the important technical work that you're doing at a local level? So let me throw that at you.
All right, well, number one, support letters. We've talked about a couple bills, AB 989, AB 1423, AB 71. All those are bills that the legislators actually do read the list of who supports a bill, and that's influential in their decision making. So that would be probably the number one thing that folks could do today.
Great.
In addition to support letters, which by the way, you can find on NPH's website, and I'm happy to hook you up with the support letters for Mark's bills too. So plenty of those.
Yeah,
but in
the chat if you get a chance, Pedro, in the last.
Happy to do that. Another way that everyone can support is Santa Clara County is going to need over the next 8 years to accommodate an additional close to 130,000 new homes. That's a tremendous amount of homes. That's unlike probably anything that the county has had to accommodate since it was first built. And given just the momentous challenge that represents and how most of those homes will need to be affordable, what would be helpful is as SV at Home engages in this work and helps local governments plan, tell us what's working, what's not working with housing bills. Let us know how we can partner with you, because if you tell us, hey, trying to build affordable housing here in Sunnyvale and X barrier is keeping it from happening, is there anything the state can do? That's something that we can be helpful to you on. It's really a partnership. And so in addition to support letters, calling into committee hearings, it's also informing us about what's going on and informing Assemblymember Kalra, Senator Cortese. So it creates this whole system where we're all collectively addressing these issues together.
Yeah. So I have a quick, easy answer on that. Staff up HCDs so that they're a real threat when we're working with local governments to get the housing elements right. Graciela, any last words?
I was going to say, I actually have seen a lot of activism with people going to council meetings, going to local planning meetings, and making sure, to Pedro's point, that we are helping to hold local governments accountable. On one hand, I appreciate that sometimes they don't necessarily have all the resources, but when it's just people not used to dealing with the need that we have when it comes to housing, just helping us hold everyone accountable. I think you've seen a lot of pieces of legislation that have actually sought to give HUD more authority or provided additional tools to local governments. And a lot of the times at the state level, we can't necessarily monitor all of the different cities. But so if you hear of different things happening, let us know. Let your assembly members and senators know what's going on.
Great. All right. With that, I am going to turn it over to Rick. He's going to thank you, but I want to thank you personally, all of you, for participating. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you, Matthew, and thank you, Pedro, Graciela, and Mark. For sure, we really appreciate your insights. There was a lot of great information. There's a lot going on this year, and it's all sounding pretty good, but we have a lot of work to do. So thank you for doing what you do and keeping us informed and keeping the ball moving forward. We do want to ask our audience to take a quick poll and let us know who you are and how we're doing, and we'll give you a minute to do that. It should be up there now, and if you could just take 10 seconds to click the button and hit submit, we'd really appreciate that. We're also inviting you to, well, tomorrow's the last day of the month, and so we do have some events, and we'd love to have you join us for the conversation as we continue talking about housing and what it means to the Silicon Valley. Tomorrow, we're going to be discussing a model for agricultural workforce housing in South County, and we're really excited about the panel of experts that will be involved to discuss what's going on down there and how to make that housing possible. We are just 1 minute over, so we're going to close the poll. And we're going to thank you again, and to all of our panelists and legislators who joined us here today. This was a really great event with a lot of fantastic information. Enjoy your day, and thanks for supporting SV at Home and housing. Become a member.